As usual, another great guest, but a quick diversion. You'll notice that our full name is the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, and Freedom. Well, let's talk about your health for a moment. If you'd like to escape from the stranglehold of insurance and be able to see alternative doctors or go across state lines for care, then you definitely need to take a look at patientempowerment.mpb.health and see if that's the fix you've been looking for. Now, let's get back to the show.
Welcome, folks, to Freedom Hub. And today we are very pleased to have our co-host Jim Grapek along with me every Thursday at noon, and excited to have Professor Ebeling return. He spoke a year ago or so. I always say a year ago because after 3 straight years of doing this every week, I forget actually when our friends presented last. Pretty sure, and we can look at the YouTube channel or the Rumble channel, that he presented a case against the Fed, our central bank, which everyone should know about, because you really can't understand history or political economy if you don't understand the role of the banksters in funding both sides of conflicts and giving easy money to the special interest to take control of the governments in every society across the earth. Today's a great topic. It's a what if story, and we want to discuss this because it deals with the pinnacle of economics, the Austrian school, and a possibility that could have avoided the hundreds of millions of deaths and centralization of all the governments over the past century. And real quick, the Austrian school was founded by Carl Menger in the late 19th century, and he ended up educating the prince who was in line to take over the Austrian Empire a century ago. And a lot of libertarians, and Richard tells me non-libertarians, historians, smart people say a lot that, with President Wilson being probably our worst president in history, with that trifecta in 1913 with the Fed, the income tax, and popular senatorial election. Also interloped us in the Great War, which was not needed because both sides probably were on track to sue for peace. And if the Germans and English had done so, we wouldn't have gotten fascism, communism, the Cold War, or even today's technocracy. That's a bold statement, but a lot of people believe that. And we're going to hear that case today. And then we have to wonder, with Mises being the Chamber of Commerce head at Vienna, and Menger founding the school and educating decision makers like the Crown Prince, and without us interfering in World War I, could we have now a much more libertarian, tolerant, vibrant society worldwide if a lot of things that we didn't do? Professor Ebeling is widely, he's written a lot of books, and Amazon, you can just scroll down and just see them. He really wants to highlight For a New Liberalism, this book here at Amazon. I'm sure he can say where else you can get it, AEIR or other organizations. This one here, Between Two Wars, on Mises' Lost Writings, looks exciting. He can talk more about that. He teaches econ in a business school, the Citadel. And he says all his fellow professors are free market supporters, which it makes us feel good, because we want our kids to learn more honest economics and not this socialist claptrap that they all graduate with. So Richard, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's wonderful to be with you again. Thanks for having me on.
Do you want to kind of say a little bit about this essay you wrote about the education of the Crown Prince?
Yes. We're talking about Crown Prince Rudolph, the only son of the long-reigning Austro-Hungarian emperor, Franz Josef. Franz Josef ended up being on the Austrian throne for over half a century. It was not the same quite years, but a long reign, like we think of Queen Victoria in Great Britain, like forever in the 19th and early 20th century. And Crown Prince Rudolph, his only son and obviously the heir apparent, was being groomed to eventually take the throne. And obviously the Crown Prince needed to be educated in those areas of public and social and cultural life that were viewed as essential for an informed, knowledgeable, and quote, good emperor, a benevolent emperor, an emperor concerned with the well-being and the prosperity of his subjects. So the Franz Josef, the emperor, had to look around to find a variety of tutors, and the subject of political economy is one that was expected for the Crown Prince to learn, economics. So he turned to what at that time was a relatively young Carl Menger in his 30s. He had written what we now view as a famous book in 1871, laying down his version of what we call the theory of marginal utility, subjective value, against the classical and also socialist notion of a labor theory of value. He was appointed to the University of Vienna in 1873. And so then in late 1875, the royal house approached him to be Prince Rudolph's tutor. And from January through April of 1876, he was giving these series of lectures on the foundational principles and meanings of economics, the market process, the competitive order, the nature and role of government in a free society from the economist's point of view. And they became close friends, so much so that 2 years later in 1878, they jointly authored what was published anonymously, because you couldn't have the heir apparent say certain things in public with his name on it, criticizing the Austrian aristocracy for having lost its rationale for existence. They had fallen into the pleasures of drink and merriment, and no longer were meant as a virtuous example to the people. And that sense of an image and the values of society were beginning to fall more on the image and the standards of the bourgeois values, hard work, independence, savings, investment, example for another generation. So those were sort of like the wider sort of cultural values that they approached it. And then, of course, as the heir apparent, Prince Rudolph would periodically be sent on royal trips around Europe, visit other places, ceremonies, meetings with other members of royal families throughout Europe. And it was quite often Carl Menger accompanied him. Obviously, Menger was older than him, but the fact is they became fast friends. And to be honest, before getting into, well, what did Menger, teach the Crown Prince? The tragedy is that Rudolph had gotten married through more or less arranged marriage, right? Monarchies used to do that type of thing. And it was an unhappy marriage. And he ended up having a mistress. And the result is that in a suicide pact, he and his mistress committed suicide in 1889. And obviously this crushed Menger from all accounts, because a close and dear young friend of his had chosen to take his own life. But there was also the fact that Franz Josef, his father, lived to a very old age. He didn't die until 1916 in the midst of the First World War. So the question was, even if young Crown Prince Rudolph had lived, when or how might he have taken the throne? But what can be said is that because of the ideas that he had adopted himself and had learned from tutors like Menger, particularly on the role of government, the nature of markets, the importance of personal freedom and self-responsibility as guideposts for a successful and prosperous and good society, even if he never came to the throne before the empire collapsed at the end of the First World War, he might very well have been able to indirectly influence the tone and direction of a variety of Austrian government policies at a time that became increasingly difficult within Austria and throughout the empire because of the growing undercurrent forces of both nationalism and socialism that eventually, like a volcano, exploded out of the midst of the First World War, leading to so many disasters in the period between the two world wars, including leading to the Second World War.
So what are some of those Austrian economic principles that could have trickled into the leadership of the Austrian Empire?
Well, let me explain. How do we know this? How do we know what Menger taught the Crown Prince? Carl Menger's papers are at Duke University in North Carolina. And a good number of years ago, back in the 1980s or early 1990s, these lectures were found among his papers. And an Austrian economist named Erich Streissler, who was teaching at the University of Vienna, and his wife, Monica Streissler, decided to translate these. So in around 1994, 1995, they were published by a publisher called Edward Elgar. You could actually buy the book still on Amazon. There's actually a free PDF version if you go to Z Library. And so what it is, what it was, Menger gave these lectures, and then the Crown Prince had to prepare detailed, specific summaries of what Menger had said to him, which Menger would then correct to make sure that the Crown Prince had basically learned the lectures. And that is what was published in the 1990s, 1994, if I remember correctly, and is the basis of this. But what we get out of this is that besides Menger explaining the general principles of supply and demand, how competition works, the value of the profit motive, all of which are essential to a successful market system, he explained especially the importance of the institution of private property, that without property, there is neither liberty nor prosperity in a society. He also emphasized that if he was to be a good emperor, that is, one who was interested truly in the well-being of his subjects when he came to the throne someday, it was necessary to realize that the greatest gift that an emperor could give to the people, remember, we're talking about a time when monarchies were still prevalent, and this is the way people thought, that a good emperor, a good king, should be concerned with establishing and helping to foster and cultivate the freedom and the independence of the people. Menger constantly hammers away. It's right there in the lectures. The dangers of political paternalism, the undesirability of the government become the guardian of the people. A good people, a happy people, a prosperous and successful people are people who have individual freedom over their own lives, both in the market and outside of the market, have self-responsibility for themselves and their families, which create incentives and motives looking to the future, including the benefits that the parent leaves to the child, inheritance, and that the good government can do no more than basically establish the institutional order, impartial rule of law, sound, recognized, and enforced property rights against the growing dangers, and he makes it very clear, of socialism and communism. Communism would crush freedom, it would be a despotism. Socialism would destroy self-responsibility and the ability of the individual to make his own decisions from life. He'd be a slave to the state. He basically uses language like this. And that therefore, what he basically lays out is that what would be the parameters in his mind of a good government. And in its essence, it's what Adam Smith lays out in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations. And it's basically Adam Smith's notion of a system of natural liberty, where the government has only a small number of essential but limited functions. Police and courts, that is to assure domestic tranquility from bandits, thieves, and cutthroats. National defense, because there can be, from the defensive point of view, bandits and thieves who might attempt to invade and conquer your country. And then, as has often been considered, what we now would call a few public works, bridges, roads, a harbor, he did believe in certain, but not dominating, essential limited education, the subjects of the empire should have basic literacy to be informed enough to be self-supporting and self-thinking citizens guiding their own lives. But except for a few things like that, Menger basically lays out what has traditionally been considered a more or less laissez-faire framework of free men in a free market in which government protects rights and does not violate them. And the danger always that the emperor and the bureaucrats must keep in mind, and the emperor is to make sure the bureaucrats don't forget it, is to never sneak in or fall into any form of paternalism that would undermine the virtue and the goodness of the society.
And switching to Mises over at the Vienna Business Chamber, to what extent do you think the Austrian school did proliferate that culture in Austria? Did they have a system of natural liberty to a large extent, as some folks argue?
I have to sort of make a little historical digression here, if you'll permit me. Austria had been an absolute monarchy, like most monarchs in the past. But there were revolutions in Europe in 1848, all of which ended up being crushed, basically more or less what we would call liberal, in the good sense, liberal revolutions with some socialist elements. But they were basically crushed, including in Austria, when Franz Josef was a very young man just coming on the throne. But he realized that he wasn't going to be able to rule successfully unless he accepted a much more enlightened approach. So a new constitution was promulgated in 1867. It became the new constitutional and legal basis of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because the Hungarians had pressured to have a certain degree of domestic autonomy within the Austrian Empire. Now, if you read this 1867 constitution, it captures mostly and greatly the spirit of the classical liberal ideas of the time. The importance of civil liberties, personal freedom, a wide latitude of market freedoms. There might be some degrees of protectionism between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the rest of the world, but within the Austrian Empire, there would be general free enterprise. It's sort of like the United States being a big free trade zone, right, within it. So that was the idea that Austria would be basically an open commercial trade zone within itself. That included also free movement of people from one part of the empire to the other, that there would be an equality and equality of rights before the law, and that if there were prejudices or biases imposed upon certain linguistic or ethnic groups, they could make recourse to the higher law in Vienna, the capital of the empire, for redress. This led, for example, among other things, to an equality of rights within the Habsburg Empire, the Austrian Empire, of the first basically freeing of equal rights for the relatively larger Jewish community in the domain of Franz Josef. To give you one indication of this, if I may, in the year that Ludwig von Mises was born, 1881, his great-grandfather was ennobled by Franz Josef. Now, that's why Mises's name is Ludwig von Mises, right? The V-O-N in the middle. That's a low nobility title. Well, how did Ludwig von Mises, who was Jewish, get a low nobility title? Because his great-grandfather, a few months before little Ludwig was actually born, was ennobled. And what was he being ennobled for? For his service to the emperor as the head of the Jewish community in the eastern region of Galatia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So that shows the tolerance and lack of religious bigotry under the Enlightenment of Franz Josef, that a member of what was, and Mises actually came from a relatively Orthodox Jewish family, though he was not Orthodox. The emperor was recognizing that and ennobling someone for this. And that, of course, became hereditary. So that's how the great grandfather's ennoblement of Fawn got passed on to Ludwig later on. So that shows the different environment. Now, in opposition to these liberal currents captured and specified in the Constitution, in the 1870s, in the 1880s, and 1890s, there emerges these new counter-revolutionary currents. I say counter-revolutionary because I consider freedom a great revolution compared to the tyrannies of the ancient world. So what are the counter-revolutions? Socialism and nationalism. And these become the great fights, which later Austrians like Mises end up trying to fight, both before the First World War and certainly after the First World War in the new smaller Republic of Austria. I know I'm talking too much and I'm about the history of this, and I apologize, but it's when you like something, you talk a lot. One of the other leading Austrian economists of the era before the First World War was an economist named Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk. He's well known as an economic theorist of capital and interest theory, but he also was 3 times finance minister of Austria. His longest period for 4 years, from 1900 to 1904, during which the budget was balanced, taxes were cut, spending was reduced, and regulations were kept to a minimum. So that was the types of influence that the Austrians could make at a time when counter-revolutionary collectivist forces of socialism and nationalism are starting to gain ground.
It's actually important to drone on about this, Richard. This is seriously important. So it's true what the experts say. This was a classical liberal society around Vienna for many decades.
It was cosmopolitan, widely tolerant. As one person of that time pointed out, writing nostalgically in later years after all of this had collapsed, that the politicians in the Austrian parliament, the nationalists, the socialists, the liberals, they could harangue, they could call each other names, because each of them had their ideological agenda. But then at the end of the parliamentary day, they would retire to the Vienna coffee houses and put all that aside, because it was all the front of politics. You drink together, you have the common cultural interests, you all go to the Vienna opera and listen to the music, and are not nasty or bigoted in your personal relationships. The ideologies was making them for the political show. And it was unbelievably tolerant and diverse, and I use diversity and multicultural in the non-loaded terms of today. I mean, in the most generous and proper sense. It was diverse and multicultural with great exuberance and success. Music, literature, art, science, fields like economics. It was like an oasis of civilization.
And that's the impression I get, and a lot of folks get, that our interloping in the World War I, the Great War, was a bigger tragedy than we can even discuss. It was such a horrible decision. Talk about that. I'm sure Mises has talked about it too in his book that you wrote, Between Two World Wars.
Yes.
Lamenting the tragedy of it all.
Yeah. Now, Mises actually served in the First World War. He was a captain in the Austrian army. He led an artillery unit on the Eastern Front, which meant fighting the Russians. Of course, that was before the Bolshevik Revolution. So we're talking about the Imperial Russian Army. And if you go through his war file in Vienna, at the Ministry of War, what one finds is that he was 3 times decorated for bravery under fire, for capturing Russian positions during the battles. But in later years, he lamented very clearly the tragedy of the war, not just that Austria lost, and obviously the great harm and destruction to human lives and the political and social order, but that the war destroyed that pre-war continuing glow of a liberal and open and tolerant society that had made Vienna such a magnet and an example of of what a free city and culture could be.
Yeah, you can't exaggerate that point. Dave, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, this may be taking the conversation a little bit of a different direction, but it's really fascinating to me to hear or learn more about this story. But at the same time, it's sad because we see so little of that type of what you might call statesmanship in recent history. And yeah, maybe with the exception of somebody like Governor DeSantis today. But I guess I'm wondering is how do we, how do we get some of that back? I mean, we're in a different type of political system for sure, but is there a way to kind of get back those sort of values and thinking?
Well,
And before you, Richard, before you answer, I'm showing on the screen. I thought David, you were going to where Austria is now, imposing another police state, and this this story, the fake lifting of the lockdown for the unvaccinated, doesn't apply for restaurants and non-essential businesses. But go ahead, Richard.
It's not impossible to recreate that, but it depends upon a change in the current of ideas, the attitude of what rights are, what a free society should be like, and therefore, by implication, what the role of government is. Today we are extremely cynical, and rightly so, about government. We see government as basically what Milton Friedman once referred to as the iron triangle. Politicians, bureaucrats, and special interest groups who coalesce in coalitions and in competition in the political process with each other and against each other for power, privilege, plunder, and paternalism. And it's all corrupt. What sometimes amazes me when I read those older writings, like, as I mentioned, this anonymous monograph that Crown Prince Rudolph and Menger had co-authored, or even Menger's lectures to the Crown Prince a couple of years earlier. The wise statesman, the wise statesman, the good political leader, the individual in positions of authority who realize that their responsibility is to be concerned with the well-being of their citizens, always with the implication that that means freedom and prosperity. That was certainly what guided someone like, as I mentioned, the other Austrian economist, Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, when he was finance minister. You can read some of his sort of public pronouncements to the bureaucracy, and it's clear that it's sincere. You hold a position of responsibility and honor and integrity to maintain the trustworthiness and the integrity of the system against abuse and corruption. That you are supposed to be examples for the society, not something that denigrates the society. We don't even think of politicians, let alone saying that, actually believing it. But it's clear to me some of them actually did. And that's like a bygone era. Certainly when Mises, especially in the years between the two world wars, served as a senior economic analyst at the Vienna Chamber of Commerce. That's how he made his living. He was not a professor at the university. He had the privilege of teaching one course a semester at the university as sort of an associate with no pay. Oh, we think you're so great that we're going to give you the honor of teaching the course for free. But he made his living full time as this senior economic analyst at the Vienna Chamber of Commerce. And it is clear that he, and from his memoirs, at least some of his colleagues, viewed the task of this was not to be searching for special favors and privileges for members of the business community through the Chamber of Commerce, political log rolling in the parliament, though I'm sure that went on. Well, it did go on. But his view was that that was not the role. The role was for businessmen to be interested in preserving the institutional order of freedom that enabled them to have opportunity for success and prosperity. That's a mindset that admittedly has disappeared from the scene. It seems almost like the other side of the moon today. But with a right turnaround in the political and cultural thinking of enough people, it could be returned to.
A poll just came out that despite OSHA reneging on their vaccine mandate after the Supreme Court struck it down, 50% of large businesses still are going to fire their workers if they don't want to participate in what is becoming a dangerous experiment. We know the insurance executives are saying 40% excess deaths in the past year. So it's utterly dangerous. But these CEOs are credulous. These politicians are puppets of their pharma enablers and donors. How do we institute a sense of integrity in our leaders, our influencers who have utterly failed us? Any one of them that goes out on a limb and decides to tell the truth gets ostracized. I'm thinking of Steve Kirsch, a Democrat tech tycoon who's got the best Substack out there. Substack is the new platform for people who want to actually say something useful. He's lost all his friends. He offers $1 million to any of these branch Covidians to debate him or other doctors and scientists to let people know the truth, and none of them will take his $1 million. It's heartening that the Crown Prince warned his bourgeois nobles to act the part. I guess 50 years ago we had Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. There was an ethic here in America for business people to, act with integrity. You teach in a business school, and your fellow professors have that free market integrity kind of mindset. Do you think there will be a new class of business leaders and entrepreneurs who will try to, restore American values?
Well, I think that one always has to it's very easy to become dissuaded by things, but let's never forget that revolutions, I'm talking about intellectual revolutions here, intellectual revolutions always start with and grow through one mind at a time. I like to say the following. Suppose you could go into a time machine to 1883 to a cemetery in London, and you would be observing that someone was being put to rest at a gravesite, and there was only about a dozen people around his grave, and half of them were family members. Some obscure guy, who his passing will leave no mark on the world. That was Karl Marx. Now imagine that you were some young, naive, true believing socialist at that time. Oh, Marx is dead. It's terrible. Oh, and look at the world I'm in. Everybody believes in freedom. Everybody believes in limited government. Nobody wants to give up their private property. Even workers are suspicious of the socialists. Oh, how can we ever achieve this? Now, I know Marx talked about the laws of history and stuff, but intuitively, all the socialists understood that if they were going to win, they were going to have to argue, persuade, reason, debate, one person at a time, one person at a time, one mind at a time. And if you were at Marx's grave in 1883, who would have imagined that 50 or 60 years later, there'd be the rise and the triumph of communism in Russia, or these other forms of collectivism, or communism of a Mao type in China? It would have been unimaginable in 1883. Now, that tells me that nothing is inevitable and everything is possible. All we need to do is to have the willingness and the integrity and the knowledge to persuade our fellow citizens that the path that we're following is a dangerous and disastrous one, to explain to them what liberty means and why it is important, how markets work, and how government is the sand in the machine and not the one that keeps it on an even keel, and that government is a very dangerous institution in society. The founding fathers, when they proposed and set up this constitution, were quite cognizant in division of powers, limiting what the federal authority was to be, incorporating a Bill of Rights saying, no, even if 99% of the population wants to shut you up, the First Amendment says they can't. That's basically saying the liberty of the individual against the huge majority. If we can teach them and explain to them the importance of those principles again, in our various avenues of life. I try to do it as a professor in my lecturing, my writing. Other people do it talking to their family members, their co-workers, a conversation they end up in about politics and current events and things. But each of us has to take a little bit of this responsibility and achieve this. If I could just continue with this a minute or two more, Charles. When I was in my 20s, I attended a week-long seminar at the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE. And one of the speakers there was the founder of FEE, Leonard E. Reed. And there were a lot of great lectures, but there was one lecture by him that is the only one that has stuck in my mind. The old mansion building that used to be in Irvington on Hudson had a lecture hall. We were sitting in the lecture hall, and Leonard Reed asks someone in the back of the room, please turn out the lights. So now we're in the dark. And he had a small electric candle in his hand, and with like a dimmer switch. And so he starts slightly turning it, and there's just a flicker of light. And Leonard Reed said, now look at this little lit flicker of light. Even though it's small, all of our eyes are drawn to it. And he starts turning the dimmer switch a little bit more, slightly brighter. Notice now that you can see me and maybe the beginning of the front row. Turned up more and more until finally he says, notice, I've turned it to its maximum light. And one little candle has illuminated the entire room with just some darkness in the corners. Each of us can be that, lights of liberty. The more brighter we are is a reflection of how much we know and care about and develop means of articulating the case for liberty. And when enough of us have helped each other to become illuminations of liberty, collectivism and statism will be shoved into the corners of darkness in just a few remaining places, and liberty will have triumphed again. That has always stuck in my mind. It's all of us, one person at a time, Charles. What you do, what I do, what the listeners and viewers try to do in their corners of life. Everything starts with each one of us.
Yeah. And co-host Jim Grapek, do you want to do your nuggets here? And maybe that'll elicit some other questions. I do want to get to the Hoppe thesis about the risk of mob rule and whether property owning monarchs may offer a better classical liberalism promise, as evidenced by the Austrian Empire. Go ahead, Jim.
Thank you, Charles. Richard, I just want to comment on that last, what you were saying. It seems to me that does make sense, and certainly we're each the light in bringing that forward. My sense, though, is going back in terms of the collectivism, socialism, what we see today, all of these tyrants, basically. I mean, from the school boards, to the governors, to the heads of state. I cannot believe or imagine this is everybody just sat down and said, I really like collectivism. I love this policy. I think this is how we should run things. I think they've done a great job of controlling people, bribing people, control files, whatever it is. And that's how they kind of suck them in. over time in a lot of clever ways and devious. So, but still, we absolutely need the light to expose what's going on and for all of us to see this. I mean, everybody wants to be happy, you know, and like have basic privileges, I think, and freedoms, freeness. Well, what I was going to say, two things, and funny, Charles, there was I just caught this earlier. The free COVID tests that the Biden administration is putting out are coming from China. Just wanted to throw that out there, a little off camber. Related to this, I heard yesterday, I was riding on the metro, actually on going down to the rally the other day on Sunday. And there were people talking about a way to overthrow these tyrants. And it had to do with bonds, with surety bonds. Every public official has to be bonded. And it's essentially, it's like malpractice insurance for a doctor. So it takes, I believe it's a couple of people can get together and you can actually go to, I heard a great talk the next day on the SGT report. So what I'm going to do is put links in the chat box for you and we'll post this. But it turns out that these, as long as the government officials at school board, health administrators, you know, health department officials, et cetera, as long as they don't break any laws, they're covered by their bond. You know, they're not liable personally. But all of them practically are breaking laws, from the Constitution to state constitutions, et cetera. I mean, it's easy to find now. And these people have started basically going up, challenging their bonds and winning. In other words, they go to the school boards, they go to a health department official and say, look, this is what you have to change. Get rid of the mask mandate, no more vaccines, whatever it is. And of course, they put up a fight and then they say, well, I mean, it's a couple of days. Basically, we're going to go and file a complaint against your surety bond. And that happens. First of all, these guys have generally a $40,000 deductible policy. So, you know, they'll at least have to shell that out probably. And if they end up going into a real fight or losing their bond, they're on the hook for $1 million typically. And there have been a lot of, you know, given that all of these boards are saying, and there's already success stories are saying they just cancel the mandates. And some people have been hung out to dry. So I think this is great. The other thing is if you're an official and your bond gets challenged, first of all, it's like anything else, your premiums can go up. And if you lose that bond, you have to be removed from office because an official cannot be in office without one of these bonds. So I just wanted to share that. I'll post some things up. There's a website also, bondsforthewin.com. They go, all the steps are outlined there. And I think this is for all of us really important. And maybe it'll help move things forward and get that light out there to everybody. So thank you, Charles.
I think that's a great institutional device to put people on notice and to pressure them and make them back down. But I believe that as a complement to that, taking not just, well, how do we stop them today? This is a way to try to, you know, stop them in their tracks in various and sundry ways, or even to repeal what they've attempted to do. But complementing that has to also be the long run fight for the intellectual and political climate of the country, because otherwise it'll just be another crisis and they'll already be set to do it again and again. And you know, it's like the beanbag, you punch it in one place and it pops out in another place. Ultimately, what made America great in the 19th century, for the most part, was the spirit and the belief of people that they were to manage and control and direct their own lives. And that government might be this necessary thing, this necessary evil, to use Thomas Paine's phrase, but that basically government is there to basically just do a handful of things. And you are a self-independent, responsible individual, freely associating with your neighbors and trading with them, associating with them in both the marketplace and outside of the marketplace. This belief that that there are common community and social problems that we may share in common, but that's what the non-governmental institutions of civil society are for: charity, philanthropy, clubs, associations. It's, you know, the imagery of like the town volunteer fire department as a caricature of that, and so on and so forth. But that was the spirit of people. Today, people have lost that both understanding and spirit. I think it can be regained. If it was once there, because before it was there, it wasn't there. It emerged over the last 300 to 400 years in certain parts of the world originally, and then slowly spread to more people around the world, though still a minority of them. What has been lost can be regained, but we need to fight that long-run battle of ideas. When you say, you know, standard things like, oh, we need to plan, you know, the environment, healthcare. The question is, but whose plan? Are you going to impose one single compulsory government plan on everyone? Or are you respecting each person to make his own plan, guided by his own family and personal needs and circumstances and judgments as to what are the costs we're incurring? Or are you going to impose one plan on everyone, one regulatory straitjacket on all? Do you think that people are self-governing individuals, or do you view them as political puppets at the end of a string to be manipulated by others? This is the wider case, and the understanding that you have a right to be free. You have a right to the liberty of your own life, and should want it and take it seriously and be respectful of your neighbors as well. That was the spirit of a good many Americans in the 19th century. And that's what we have to restore to be the foundational basis of using these other more immediate institutional methods to hold them back.
I heard a doctor saying something very interesting the other day that, oh, we have a pandemic, a COVID crisis, a health crisis. You know, he said, I've grown up my whole life with crises. There's a you know, a drug crisis, there's a crime crisis, everything's a crisis. And we need to stop that. We need to change that, like put our foot down. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts to share on that, or maybe that goes back to the earlier times in the 19th century. When did these crises start? And is this part of that plan to just make us all crazy? You know, we need government. We need government.
You know, the thing is that what strikes you, you know, maybe some of the viewers will be familiar with the famous 19th century French social philosopher, Alexis de Tocqueville. He wrote his famous book, Democracy in America. It's kind of a classic of political science. Traveled around the United States for 2 years, went back to France, wrote this book. It's considered, you know, one of the great works of the 19th century. In volume 2, he highlights that whenever an American feels that there's a problem, an issue that needs to be taken care of, a crisis, if you want to use that word, he immediately tries to find others who understand and share that concern, and they form voluntary associations, first in their community and then across their state. And remember, we're talking about a time when you got around on a horse or a sailboat, right? People would travel and come together and congregate to meet and form an association, a private association, to solve these problems, whatever their form and nature. And he even tells his French readers, of course he means Europeans who are reading his book in general, that this is an aspect of American society that should get our attention, that they take these matters in their own hands, and unlike us, they don't presume they have to rely upon government. That's an important spirit that we should try to regain.
Indeed. What was it, 15 years ago? There was a lot of de Tocqueville events going on in the media, and it was really great. People were learning about association solutions. And Dave, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah. So I just had another thought after kind of hearing what others have said here, that, you know, in a sense, the group that is attending this webinar, you know, we are sort of outliers in the sense that, you know, we're, you know, more diligent than kind of most people in terms of trying to understand certain things about the world and how we think things ought to be or what have you. But we definitely have made some headway in terms of changing, educating people and getting others to appreciate liberty. But I guess also with this whole COVID tyranny, we are definitely seeing a lot of people wake up because I think to some extent concepts of liberty and free markets may seem kind of like an abstraction to a lot of people, but when you see them basically destroyed before your very eyes, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait a minute, these things are really important. So that's I think the bright side of what's happening today.
If I can sort of pick up on that, it's always easy to be gloom and doom, but there are always undercurrents that are positive signs. For example, let's suppose that we would turn to the media 50 or 60 years ago and find if there's any articles or discussions of homeschooling. There were virtually no homeschool people, much of a very small fraction. They were considered nuts. Well, fast forward to just the 1990s. They were having articles, oh, the growing homeschool movement. It becomes legitimate. It's certainly not fully mainstream. Most kids still go to government schools. But it became legitimate because it became a large enough group. With the growing concern about the entitlement programs, particularly Social Security back in the 1990s and after that. What did people start doing? I can't rely upon Social Security. I better be planning for retirement funds and sources of future income myself, money markets, mutual funds, and so on. So in fact, though many people didn't understand the politics or the ideology of it, they sensed that government was doing things that were either dangerous in the sense of their own future or wrongheaded in terms of their concerns, the education of my child, my own financial security looking to the years ahead. And I think that out of this COVID thing, the lockdowns of the schools, of the refusal of so many the members of the teachers unions in government schools, refusing to go back to work, can be forces and ideas and experiences that we can play upon. I'm not using that in a derogatory or surreptitious way, but use as entrees to explain to our fellow citizens, look, do you really want to continue relying upon this? Do you want government to have the authority and the power merely because some handful of people panic and presume that they're the experts to shut our society down? Do not produce. Do not go to work. Do not leave your home or apartment. Only go shopping for what we tell you to. And then they're shocked in those in government. How could unemployment have been going up? How could production have been falling? I'm shocked. We have to make sure that our fellow citizens understand that whatever dangers this virus has had, I've had friends who have become ill or died from it. Okay, this is not. It can be a serious thing. But to turn to the government and give government such arbitrary and intrusive and near totalitarian power is to look for avenues of handling such a crisis that ends up being worse than the disease for a growing number of people in the society and for the institutions of that society in general.
And Linda, you want to unmute yourself for the last question?
Yes. I have a son. He's 36 years old and he has autism. He's genius. He finished college with straight A. And I was taking him with me to my lectures for him to get educated. And because for him not to disrupt my students, I was presenting my PowerPoint slides at home before going to the university. So those slides were about the evolution of the different species, like let's see from bacteria to plants to animals, and then on the top was the human species. And then my son asked me, Mom, I think that humans are the error of evolution and of nature. What do you think? So I remain really speechless. And I answered to him, George, I am very busy right now. I cannot answer to you, but I will do that later on. And then I went outside in my balcony with my cell phone. I call a philosopher, fantastic professor I used to have at the university in Paris, France. And I told him what to answer to my son. And his answer was, you know, your son, because he has autism, he's thinking out of the box. And he's absolutely right. There is no other species on Earth thinking and constructing things, items to kill the same species, to destroy the nest of the same species. And he gave me some examples of total civilization which have been destroyed. They have no trace, total. So I am very skeptical, very pessimistic. Of course, we can do the best, but also the worst. What do you think?
Obviously, we are strange creatures. We are the only creature on this planet, for the most part, who seems to take pleasure in being cruel, in imposing pain on others just for the
Yes.
perverse psychological pleasure of it. We are also the people of love, compassion, creativity, innovation, politeness, courtesy, prosperity. We've transformed this planet in many ways that have not only resulted in us prospering, but other forms of life. Everybody talks about endangered species, and species are always getting endangered all the time. But the fact is that there are many species that might have died out, that because of market opportunities and the profit motive have survived. People worry about the bald-headed eagle going extinct. Does anybody worry about cows? Does anybody worry about dogs or cats? No, because people see benefits and values to their own lives and their market opportunities to preserve and conserve, economize, and in fact improve. There's more forested land in the United States today than at the beginning of the 20th century. And that's because people see values in this. The richer we become, the more we see the value in various things, including beauty and nature, and wish to preserve them, either personally or collectively. Unfortunately, I think more should be done outside of government through voluntary association for these purposes, as we were just talking about. But that's an inclination and a spirit in people. So yes, humans with their consciousness and intelligence can do great evil things, as they have during the last 100 years to tens of millions of their fellow human beings. But they have also brought great wonders of beauty and prosperity, kindness and dignity to many others of the hundreds of now billions of people on this earth, tens of billions of billions of people on this earth.
So Richard, let's have a final comment from you on what was lost from the Great War sabotage of the promise of the Austrian Empire and the teachers, Bavaric and Menger, and how we can get to where we want to go and how folks can reach you.
I'm just saying that the world that was lost with the First World War, sometimes history has its watersheds, as the phrase goes. And the watershed of the First World War is that it undermined the institutions of private property, the respect for the independence of the individual, a shifting of a presumption of the right and the responsibility and the ability of government to control, plan, direct, command, and determine people's futures, certainly guided by this idea of the war effort. A nation has to be centrally directed to fight and survive and triumph in the war. And the socialist ideas that were basically minority ideas for the most part before the First World War gained an entree to the experiences of war economies and war mentalities to say, well, if we could do these things in war, why can't we do them in peace for prosperity rather than destruction? And those are the things that were destroyed. The presumption that freedom was good and individuals should be respected in their autonomy and dignity, and that government has a role, but an extremely narrow one. And the war helped to overthrow that and give us what we've had now for over this last century.
And how do folks reach you?
Excuse me?
And how do folks reach you or follow your work?
Well, I write a very regular article for the American Institute for Economic Research, AIER. If you go to their website and punch in my name, you'll be led to a wide directory of my articles. The AIER has recently published this book of mine for New Liberalism, and I write a once-a-month article for the monthly publication of the Future of Freedom Foundation called Future Freedom. And I also can be reached at the Citadel, Ebeling at citadel.edu, if anyone would like to have a personal communication.
So what about your wealth? If your money could actually talk to you, would you listen to it? Well, with the DNA Network Academy, your money actually can talk to you. And it's going to tell you just what it told this client. This family had over 24 debts, mortgages, car loans, the works. They were on track to take 20 years to pay it all off and instead did it in 8.5. Plus, they did it without refinancing, making more money, or even changing their lifestyle. So find out for yourself with a free analysis that is completely confidential. No personal information, no social security numbers, no credit checks, none of that nonsense. But what is exciting is that the outcome of that report you receive is a guaranteed outcome for you. To get that report, head on over to bit.ly/debt to wealth. You will arrive at this simple form. Fill it in as simple as lender number 1 and credit card number 2. What really matters is the accuracy of your numbers. You'll be able to see that if instead of 20 years or whatever your number is, that you may actually be out of debt and on your way to wealth in as little as 6.3 years like this client.